What's up, guys? Coach Braydon here with Look Like You Lift. And before we get into the debate with Cass and Ella, I just wanted to give a little bit of context of what started this whole thing. So, Cass and I had a previous podcast where we were talking about the collapse of honest discourse online, especially in the fitness industry. And that got a lot of traction. A lot of people saw that. And one of them was Scientific Snitch. Scientific Snitch has had some disagreements with Kassem Hanson. And so instead of bickering back and forth on Instagram, which is not productive, they both agreed to hop on and let me moderate a debate between the two. So I'm very excited for this conversation for a few reasons. Number one, this shows that we can have honest discourse, we can disagree, and we can have a discussion about our disagreements in a mature manner, which I think is much well lost in the fitness industry. And the second thing, this is really exciting because a lot of people are starting to come out and saying, hey, we disagree on this topic, let's hop on and hash it out, which is really cool to see. Enjoy this. If you can, give Scientific Snitch a follow, give N1 Education a follow. They're both great creators. Drop in the comments who you think won the debate. If there was a winner, let me know your thoughts and let's get into it. Let's kick it off then. So a couple rules that I have here is obviously no personal attacks, no talking over one another. If I see that we're going in circles or if I see that the goalpost is being moved, I will get us back on track. If I see this is getting out of hand, I will mute either one of you until you calm down. I don't anticipate that happening, but just letting you know. Yeah, I want a good, clean fight. So with that said, let's jump in. So let's kick it off. So what is the beef between Cass and L? What's going on? Who wants to start?
I'm
You
gonna
should go
be
ahead, Health.
honest. Oh, so sorry. Go right ahead. If
Well,
you
I was actually just saying, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, I feel like this kind of started with the whole entire eccentric, concentric thing, which kind of felt more like a misunderstanding rather than a call out. And just I guess, the meme of it. I don't know how to call that post. It put me off on the wrong footing. And that's, I guess, the main thing. I'm always open to talking with people in my DMs. I have my DMs very open. And I've made it very clear on my channel about that. And I feel like it was like a little bit, I don't know, the misinterpretation put me on, it gave me a bad taste in my mouth. And then when I guess your friend DM'd me, and then he literally ran in circles the entire time I spoke to him, and then eventually posted me on his story, like calling me like Kamala for whatever reason. That just, it didn't feel right. So yeah, that's the beef on my end.
I don't know what you're talking about in terms of a friend of mine DMing you or like, yeah, I have no idea. Are we're just attributing people as my friends because they follow me or like my content? Um,
No. He DM'd you. He sent me screenshots of his DM conversation with you, and then
oh,
posted.
this is the one that offered the to do the debate or host it or whatever. Yeah. I know this guy on Instagram, but by no means is he conveying a message for me or anything. So I don't know why you would project that on me just because this person DM'd me about the discussion and I responded to them and they happen to share those posts back and forth. That doesn't make this person my friend. I just interacted with them on Instagram. And I would point out you posted a story saying now we're celebrating or supporting misogynists or something because I did a collaborative post with Garrett and like what Garrett does has nothing to do. I collaborated with him on a social media post about fatigue that has nothing to do. We're not friends or anything. I did a podcast with Garrett just recently and I pushed back against him on something. So I can understand why you did not like my post in the what I would say the kind of like joking or meme manner that I went about addressing your post. But the other things have nothing to do with me. Somebody else that just happened to also converse with me having a DM conversation with you that you don't like has nothing to do with me. And Garrett and you not getting along also has nothing to do with me. So I would just ask that you don't hold me responsible for your interactions with other people and you actually base them off of your direct interaction with me. I'll take responsibility for everything I do and say, but I can't take responsibility for all of Instagram.
Yeah, of course. So putting that aside, putting aside the DM conversation, because he made it sound like you guys were really affiliated. Obviously, you guys were not. So of course we can move past that. And then of course Garrett as well. Like any that was mainly a joke towards Garrett and a play at him. But yeah, no, we can push that aside. I'd say that I was mainly put off by the miscommunication side of things. So that the miscommunication combined with the mean way that you put it, yeah, it didn't feel great. But that being said, I'm all open to having an open conversation, as you can see. So here we are.
Mhm. I think us talking about the lats today will be a good way to go about how I'm viewing your content and whether or not that's a miscommunication and where kind of that fault or accountability may lie. I'll admit that I made a video that was basically a meme style video. I personally think that if I'm doing a reaction to a reaction, it's fair game. And I try not to do things mean. I try and make it funny. So the intent was not to really hurt you, but the intention was to address something that I thought was incorrect, but in kind of a funny and engaging way. Yes, it was at your expense in that case, but hopefully you didn't take it as like that. I didn't insult you or call you names or anything like that in there. So if you want to disagree with that type of content or kind of what is fair play, cool. That's a whole different conversation, but I'm not saying that the way that I go about things is the best by any means. Actually, we talked about this on our last talk, Braydon, and I'm constantly like shifting one way or another, just trying to find a balance of both what works. And with some people, I can go back and forth in a very jokingly manner, and other people that doesn't work for them as well. And it seems like that's the case here.
So yeah, I'm not a big fan of that, but yeah, of course, it's mainly that miscommunication at first was what put me off, but that's, of course, we're moving past it. We're trying to have a good conversation. And if we can get into it, I would like to talk about that miscommunication because I feel like it is relevant to, I guess, the beef that we did have or we have.
Okay.
So
Cool. I do not have that video loaded in there, just FYI, unfortunately,
Uh,
but we could always put it in post.
if you want,
yeah,
I can send it over right now.
Yeah,
please.
but it also has to be formatted for Zoom, unfortunately. I mean, you can try it.
No, no. If she can just give me the link, I can share it from my screen and I can play the audio. We'll be
Awesome.
good.
Okay.
Yep. If I can interject real quick for both of you, I've been making content for, oh, I don't know, 10 years now. And I think just the inherent nature of content when we are disagreeing or stitching or reacting, it will always come across as a little vindictive or skeptical. And that's just like the nature of the content. It's very difficult to make it, number one, engaging and still getting the point across. It's unfortunate that we, as content creators, we have to play the game a little bit to get views. That's my viewpoint when we're talking about content and coming across as mean or maybe coming across in a way that we don't like. I've had to learn from doing this for so long. I can't take things personally because they're playing the game. I know they're playing the game. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I just think that doubling down on miscommunication is also something that we should try to avoid. So that's something that I do try to avoid. If ever I miscommunicate or somebody else miscommunicates with me, I'm more than happy to clear up a miscommunication. And I'm always open to other people, like maybe they interpreted the video a different way than I did, and things like that. So I guess that was my main contention.
Okay.
Okay.
Can
Is
we
that,
can we move forward? Because I think
Let's move
we
forward.
can contextualize that in this discussion.
Yes, of
I think
course.
that's great. Let's do it. So let's go ahead and get into the lats. I know that I asked you both if you wanted opening statements. We'll keep this rather informal. If either one of you have an opening statement that you would like to open up with, now's your time. Do any of you want to start?
Want to go?
Okay. I would just like to preface that to save time so we don't go in circles around these things. I mean, one, I think you're coming in this on the side of you don't think we can bias the lats. I'm coming on the side that we can bias the lats. But I think we can both just say, hey, there's no direct hypertrophy evidence on this topic, which is why it's a topic for debate. If there was a bunch of direct evidence, we probably wouldn't be debating something that had seemed pretty well sorted out. And also just acknowledge that there's a lot of limitations in the stuff that we're going to go over, such as EMG. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time talking about all of the limitations, but I think if we want to, we could put a summary of the limitations in the caption, but that way we just don't get deviated into a technical conversation about the limitations of EMG and the types of processing we do and all of that stuff. If there's something you think that's extremely relevant, go ahead, but I'm just going to try and not spend a whole bunch of time talking about super technical stuff. I'm going to try and keep myself to stuff that is more, we'll say, viewer friendly. But yeah, that's essentially all I wanted to start with.
I guess for my opening statement, based on the current evidence that we do have, of course, it's not absolute. I am inclined to be more in favor of the idea that the lats cannot be biased by each segment. They can be functionally divided. That being said, they're not, I don't think that it's going to make a significant difference in your physique. And I guess also just to clarify the statement that I made in my very, very first video, I felt like it was too absolute, hence why I made that follow-up. That said, I think that based on the current EMG, anatomy, and tendon morphology, that you cannot bias the lats. And I probably will talk about one or two EMG technicalities for that are relevant, but I won't get into it too hard.
Yeah. I just don't want to get lost.
Yes, of
Like
course.
it's very easy to get very far from our topic at hand. Okay, cool. Do you want to go ahead and roll the first videos?
Oh,
Yeah,
honestly, you don't have to if you don't want to. If
I
it
think it'd be
takes,
important.
but go
Yeah,
for it.
I'm essentially going to address some of the things in the video point by point for at least that's how I'm going to try and follow discussion basically in the
That's fine.
same order. So I think at least for people watching.
You cannot bias the upper and lower lat during exercise for two reasons. Most muscles where biasing one part or head of that muscle is possible cross two joints in one part and only one joint in the other. This creates the anatomical structural foundation of the biomechanics that allow different parts or heads of a muscle to become biased to receive more stimulus during a movement, because one part or head of that muscle can contribute to two muscle actions while the other part can only contribute to one action. Due to this structure, one part or head of that muscle will likely receive more or less stimulus due to the mechanics of a specific movement, or will experience antagonist inhibition, which gives the other part or head of that muscle more stimulus. To provide one of many examples, the rectus femoris crosses two joints and experiences antagonist inhibition during a leg press, so all the vasti muscles are biased because they only cross one joint, and that is the knee joint. As for your latissimus dorsi, the upper and lower latissimus dorsi don't cross two joints. As a result, this muscle cannot be biased in this particular way. This whole structural foundation of different biomechanics can also translate into my second and even more convincing reason here, which is that while the insertion of the upper lat is on the humerus, the lower lat is literally inserted on the upper lat, implying that as the upper lat is recruited, you will also recruit the lower lat to a similar capacity. This aligns with current evidence that has found non-statistically significant differences between the recruitment of the upper and lower lat during different back exercises as measured by EMG amplitude. We can compare this to the statistically significant differences between EMG amplitude of muscles that cross either two joints or one joint depending on the part. So although you can argue task-dependent recruitment might non-statistically significantly bias your upper over your lower lat or vice versa, it is highly unlikely that these non-statistically significant differences will have any impact on your physique.
Cool.
Next one.
And could you play video 2 as well?
Yes.
Everything you should know about your muscular wings, aka the lats, or as they're formally referred to as the latissimus dorsi. The lats primarily originate along the lower ribs, the spinous processes of the thoracic vertebrae, and the thoracolumbar fascia. In around 86% of the population, the lats originate on the iliac crest via the thoracolumbar fascia, while in the remaining 13% of the population, the lats originate directly on the iliac crest of the hip bone. In around 2/3 of the population, the lats attach to the inferior angle of the scapula through a soft fibrous link, while in around 1/3 of the population, the muscle fibers of the lats directly attached to the inferior angle of the scapula. Now that's a lot of origin attachments for one muscle. However, origin attachments tend to be more firm and less flexible than insertion attachments, so to truly understand the biomechanics of the lats, we need to know the insertion. Now the latissimus dorsi only has one insertion point, which is on the arm bone, the humerus. So the lats primarily and directly act on the glenohumeral or major shoulder joint, directly contributing to adduction, extension, and medial rotation of the humerus. However, because the glenohumeral joint is not the only shoulder joint, the latissimus dorsi indirectly contributes to movement at the scapulothoracic, acromioclavicular, and sternoclavicular joints. That being said, the lats converge to only one insertion point, so combined with the strong evidence finding that you cannot activate different regions of the lat to a statistically or clinically significant extent, for the 15th time, you cannot bias the upper and lower lats. I rest my case.
Okay. Want to keep going?
Elle, did you want to say anything before I start with my first questions?
Yeah, two things. I actually caught a misspeak. When I said that insert on the lower lats insert on the upper lats, that was a misspeak. The upper lats and lower lats insert in the same place. That being said, they all work in a very similar way. And then aside from that, I already clarified that the absolutism, I've walked back on that statement in the sense that it's not absolute. Nothing is absolute yet. We don't have strong enough evidence in hypertrophy data to claim that it's absolute. That being said, I'm still inclined to believe that you cannot bias the upper and lower lats.
Cool. All right. I'll just start with what you just clarified, which was the insertion, because I've seen in multiple videos, comments, and stuff where you have said that the lower lats insert on the upper lats, which makes me think it wasn't just a misspeak in this video because you've said it multiple times. And so I'm curious where that came from. And you've already clarified that your position now is basically that there's one insertion. But I spent time like thinking, I know this stuff pretty well, but I have never ever seen a study that even remotely says that. And I dug and I dug and I dug and I couldn't find it. So if I'm curious if there was anything that kind of pushed you in that direction that you were thinking that at one point in time, or if that was just one of those things that came out of the ether and
So
you
I'm
now would
literally
clarify.
diagnosed. Oh, sorry. I am diagnosed with an linguistic processing disorder. So when I do say things, there are times when I just it comes out the wrong way, and there's also times where I'll literally tell people and it comes out the wrong way, even if it's in a comment section or in a voice message. So I actually spoke to my partner after making that video and commenting on it because I usually make my replies to comments the first day, but not the second. After talking to my partner, he said that you said that wrong and you should correct yourself. So I didn't see that like misspeak as a very important thing to make a whole video on. But I mean, if you think that it is, then I can. But yeah.
Well, yeah, I would say I'm a stickler for if I make a mistake, I do everything I can to make sure that goes away and then I correct it. But everybody has their own kind of approach to that. But if we're going to talk about what we think the anatomy applies into to the lat's function, in this video you were making the or in your first video you were making the argument that would be a significant factor. So with that implication, I think, yeah, it's probably due for a correction, especially because it was in your original video, several of your comments, and then also a live that you did just a couple days ago on TikTok. So it's been said multiple times. So if I had a vote, I would say, yeah, absolutely put that out as a correction. Glad we can clear that up because as far as the miscommunication stuff, like if I were just making content on this, that would be a piece of evidence where I would say this is not true. I don't have any evidence to support that, and I would list off several pieces of evidence and visuals showing that the lower lats don't appear to attach to the upper lats. They do appear to go all the way up to the tendon and just attach more inferior, or I'm sorry, superior than the upper lats.
So I just wanted to clarify. I'm not sure how much of that live you saw because I remember exactly the moment you're talking about. I did clarify on that same live that I was talking about it converging to the same point and doing the same thing. But I'm willing to make a story on that. Yeah, again, I don't know how much of that live you saw, but I did clarify it in that live.
So I watched the whole thing, but it's not impossible that I missed something. It was like an hour and a half long. Awesome. Okay, so the next thing I want to clear up in terms of what appears, at least to me, to be a contradiction is you, in the first video, the way that you described muscles that you think would have functional differentiation seems to be very similar to the anatomical description that you give the lats in the second video. At least that's the way that I interpret it. And there's also a discrepancy in how you're describing how many joints the lat crosses. And it appears that I think you have tried to clarify that by saying, well, the lat crosses joints, but more joints, but I don't consider that significant. So since there's a contradiction in those two videos, I would like to hear what your thoughts are on do the lats fit the anatomy morphology that we maybe would more highly correlate with muscles that can be differentiated or not, and what is your actual take on how many lats, or not how many lats, how many joints the lat crosses, and whether or not there's significance there?
So In the video, I also clarify that the origin attachment is a more stable and fixed attachment than the insertion attachment, which I think plays a pretty significant role in the latissimus dorsi's biomechanics and any muscle's biomechanics for that matter, and specifically tendon morphology. So if the insertion, or I don't want to say insertion, if the origin attachment on the scapula was more like an insertion, then I would be more inclined to say that the latissimus dorsi crosses two joints instead of one, or at least one part of the lat. But the thing is that the scapular attachment is very weak. The lats act as a secondary scapular depressor. They're not very strong at it, and there's multiple other muscles like the pectoralis minor, the anterior serratus, and the lower trapezius, which play a much greater role in scapular depression than the lats. So when we're talking about, let's say, like an EMG of scapular depression, you're going to see more activity there because it's surface. Same thing goes for example, like lateral bending with the obliques and stuff like that. As far as the lats crossing multiple joints, I would be more inclined to believe that they indirectly cross multiple joints by moving the shoulder girdle, because if you move the glenohumeral joint to a very large capacity like the lats can, those other joints are likely to move just because they're attached all at the same area. But the lats don't attach to the clavicle. They don't have an insertion point on the scapula that is very strong. So that's my, I guess, opinion there.
Okay. Do you mind if I share a screen to show some images?
Go right ahead.
Oh,
Absolutely.
okay. Okay.
You are host now.
All right. So I would like to discuss just a few of those things. One, a muscle either crosses a joint or it doesn't. There's no such thing as it indirectly crosses a joint. Now we can argue about like how much force a muscle can apply, but if a muscle crosses multiple joints and it either does or it doesn't, if we put tension into that muscle, the amount of force that is imparted on those joints by that tissue is going to be relevant to the internal moment arms at each joint. Now, in real world exercise, there's multiple muscles, so that doesn't mean it's the total forces across those joints, but at least it's the forces that muscle is contributing to. So if we look at something like the sternoclavicular joint, you want to talk about it as scapular elevation depression, which is still action from the sternoclavicular joint, the lats are going to have decent leverage there. And we can look at that through internal moment arms. We can look at that through change in muscle lengths, etc. So let me go ahead and just share some stuff from you that was in the Dropbox thingy there. Too many windows open, apparently.
Yeah, I had like 20 tabs open for this conversation.
There we go. There it is. Okay, cool. I was like, the one window I'm trying to share is the one that is not showing up. And do me a favor, guys. So I'm manually adjusting the sizes here so that it will be more readable. If it
Are you sharing now? Because we're not seeing anything.
Nope, I'm adjusting the size right now.
Got it.
Okay. So if it looks ridiculous, let me know, but hopefully it looks like a big image next to a head.
Wow.
All right. Yeah. See, this was the majority of my prep for this debate was figuring out how to use Zoom better, not the actual information. This is just some stuff using simulation models. So this is the thoracoscapular model from OpenSim, right? So these are models that are developed through Stanford University. I'm not saying they're perfect or not, and there's multiple models, but this is just something to give us a relative representation. So if we look at the length change in the lats through the glenohumeral joint versus the sternoclavicular and acromioclavicular joint, there's actually a greater change in range of motion, or if you want to say this maybe has some error in it, they would at least be very, very similar. So there is a ton of length change in the lats, which, I mean, that means the muscles are going to lengthen and shorten as that joint moves. So when we're talking about how significant is that joint action for the muscle, we can look at internal moment arms and we can look at muscle length change, and those are essentially going to be related because the larger the internal moment arm, the more the respective length change is going to be. So if we're looking at this, the sternoclavicular joint has about like 35 to 40-ish degrees of elevation. That's what the shoulder can do in a shruggy type motion. And then in that position, the scapular rotation actually works in the same plane of motion in that, which adds another 5 5 to 10 degrees, and then you have the distance of that joint plus then where the humeral axis is. So if the average clavicle is 6 inches, and then you have a little bit more on top of that, and then that's moving close to 45 degrees, that covers a substantial distance. And this is also a very long lever, which leads to having a significantly greater internal moment arm. So if we look at the moment arm for the different divisions of the lats, okay, the glenohumeral, so if you guys can see this image and hopefully read it, the latissimus dorsi and extension, and I'm just going to go back one. For perspective, what I did is I put this in the most advantageous position for the glenohumeral joint. So basically, I'm biasing this as far away from my argument as possible. But then if we actually look at what the leverages are between the two joints, if we were to compare the lower lats in terms of their extension, so basically this is latissimus dorsi inferior here in red, which would be what we would call lower lats, right? If we were to look at that same muscle and what its internal moment arm is for depression, it is substantially bigger, right? Essentially about 4 times the lever. And the model and everything that I chose and used here, I disadvantaged everything in terms of how the clavicle was placed, et cetera, and everything. So in reality, this is probably an underrepresentation of the difference of those. For perspective, I also did retraction on this. If we look at, say, the green line, which would be the latissimus dorsi, an extension for the superior, and then we compare that to retraction, which would be in the teal here, okay, it's not as big of a difference, but it's still like over or around double the internal moment arm in these disadvantaged conditions. So when I'm looking at that, I'm inclined to believe that this action of depression and retraction, okay, that's not an insignificant action of the lats. In fact, depending on how we qualify a primary action, it's hard to argue that the sternoclavicular action is not the more primary action to the lats. I'm going to go ahead and just stop sharing this for now since I don't need it. If we look at length change, the glenohumeral is not where the lats change the most length. If we look at internal moment arms, they're not the greatest. If we look at the joint actions where there's the most redundancy with other muscles, for shoulder extension and adduction, there's a ton of muscles because we also have the teres muscles and we have the rear delts, and they have substantial leverages, oftentimes greater than the lats in some positions and context. If we look at depression and retraction in the plane of the lats, so that's basically we're either going not backing up, but backing down or mostly down with just a little bit back, what I would consider plane of the lats have substantially better leverage to do those actions. So even though they don't directly attach to the scapula, that's not really how we look at this stuff in terms of what leverage does something have to move the scapula, because by pulling on the humerus, the scapula has to go with it, the clavicle has to go with it. That's basically how our shoulder joint functions, is we have these more distal muscles that have much better leverage, actually providing the greater force vectors on these. And a lot of the more proximal muscles work on managing the shear and stabilization of those joints. So getting back to this, can they have multiple functions? Do they cross multiple joints? I think if we could look at every reference that there possibly is that discusses this, and it will say the lats do cross the shoulder joints. They can't indirectly. They either cross it or they don't. They don't directly attach to the clavicle, no, but neither does the pec, which you referenced, and you referenced the sternoclavicular joint. In fact, I think in response to somebody's comment, you said the sternoclavicular joint exists, and you use that as the rationale for why the pecs can fit this argument. And the pecs and the lats have essentially the same relationship with the sternoclavicular joint, in that the pecs attach to the sternum on the front, right, and then to the humerus. And so they move their action on the sternoclavicular joint is from going through the humerus. On the back, the lats attach, essentially, you can call it to the spine and the thoracolumbar fascia, et cetera, but they attach to the humerus. And so they move the sternoclavicular joint and the scapula through the humerus. Both the pecs and the lats move the shoulder girdle through their forces on the humerus. So I don't know how you can make one rule for the pecs in this case and a different rule for the lats, I don't know how we can say that the other non-glenohumeral joints are not significant when the lats go through a greater range of motion and have greater internal leverages at that joint. So for me, when I look at how those leverages differ between the upper and lower lats, which are much more substantial than any differences at the glenohumeral joint, it to me seems like this should be something that we could very easily bias with movements that are more of a pull down than a road. Now, if we're talking about just comparing glenohumeral actions, I'm going to say that, yeah, we're going to see much less differences because the function of the different divisions is more similar at the glenohumeral joint than it is at the sternoclavicular joint. So if we compare frontal to sagittal plane pull downs, I wouldn't expect a big difference. If we compare pull downs to rows, that's where I would expect it. And as we get into more of the research, we're going to realize that's just something that we don't actually have this kind of regional data on. So I know I've been talking for a minute, so I'm going to go ahead and let you respond before I continue on.
So first, I just wanted to state that I don't believe that internal moment arms of a single muscle, like just the latissimus dorsi alone, would give a full picture because, as I said before, there are other muscles like your anterior serratus, your lower trapezius, your pectoralis minor, which all are likely to play a much stronger role in scapular depression. And then as for the sternoclavicular joint, you've got muscles that like the sternocleidomastoid, which more significantly move the sternoclavicular joint and can do so independently of other joints. Now, that brings me to my second point, which I don't believe that there is really such things, or there is really such a definitive clarification between a direct or indirect crossing of a joint. And that's mainly because the latissimus dorsi cannot significantly move the sternoclavicular joint independently of the glenohumeral joint, the acromioclavicular joint, and the scapulothoracic joint. So I think it is fair to say that the sternoclavicular joint is indirectly crossed by the latissimus dorsi, but not directly, because you can't move the sternoclavicular joint from the lats perspective without also moving the glenohumeral, or if or like very significantly with scapular thoracic, at least it's very insignificant. And that brings me to my third point, which is when I was looking at your model, you had a pretty firm attachment onto the lower end of the scapula. Two-thirds of the population has barely any a few fibers attached to the scapula at the inferior angle.
There's no attachment to the scapula in that model. It just looks like it because you can't see it go all the way around. Just clarifying that for you.
Okay, so if there's no attachment to the scapula in that model, that even more so brings the point where if it's not directly attached to the bone and it's not directly influencing that joint independently of moving another joint, how can you claim that it's directly moving that joint? So I think that it's not very, and then I'll talk, as for the pectoralis major, the pectoralis major does originate on the clavicle. So that's why I said it can move the sternoclavicular joint because it's literally attached to it. So I think those are some crucial things to consider when we're talking about direct versus indirect crossing of a joint.
Okay. Let me know if I forget to cover any of those. So the clavicular pec attaches between the clavicle and the humerus. So it approximates the humerus to the clavicle. It does not move the clavicle relative to the rib cage. You would have to have the humerus fixed. And then again, you would be pulling the clavicle to the humerus. It does not move the rib cage. So the clavicular pec does not act on the sternoclavicular joint the way the sternocostal pec or the latissimus dorsi are. So basically, the clavicular pec is you could call that more of a single joint action, as it's going to basically just approximate these two things. But the clavicular pec cannot do protraction or depression or any of those things because it only attaches between the clavicle and the humerus. Whereas these pecs here that attach to the sternum, by going around to the humerus, now this does become an axis for them to do protraction and retraction, etc. Okay. In terms of the other muscles, like saying that they have better leverage or be more involved. So take, for example, the serratus anterior, right? So the serratus anterior, if we look at that muscle is really involved in rotation of the scapula, right? Only a very small portion of it could act on depression, and actually in certain positions, it's elevating the scapula too, depending on the rotation and orientation. And when we look at EMG stuff, the serratus anterior is decently active in antagonistic motions of a pull down. So basically, if I'm doing flexion and protraction here. So if I have my arm protracted and I'm trying to lift it up, essentially the reverse of a pull down, the serratus anterior is essentially active in the antagonist of these motions that we would be using for the lats. Okay. It also, just by its attachments points, does not have the same internal moment. Like the lower portion of the lats, in terms of talking about depression, has a longer internal moment arm than the serratus anterior, and more of the lats cross-sectional area can act on that than the serratus anterior. For the lower traps, again, you have this thing where the lower traps, they attach on the medial portion of the scapula, right? And they are also active in relative antagonist motions. So we know that in these motions, there has to be some sort of counterforce or coordination with that for them to be able to be doing this. They're not going to be one. He has even less leverage attaching more medially, right? So even a smaller internal moment arm for depression. But the fact that it is on the medial portion of the scapula means that in order for it to translate that force, it also has to be applying that rotation. So the lats, on the other hand, they can be depressing the shoulder without influencing rotation as much. Now, if you want to talk, I don't think that for this conversation, the attachment to the scapula, it's not essential for my argument or my case. Like if you want to talk about it, I think more consensus function of that is basically tracking or basically keeping the scapula set to the rib cage. So even when that attachment isn't present, they call it a hammock structure, where the portion of the superior lat kind of goes over the bottom portion of the scapula to keep it from winging or flopping out. So when we're looking at variations in that muscle, I think the attachment is relevant to how well that person's positioned to actually have that hammock formation, or whether a physical attachment actually suits that. Also, when we see these variations in anatomy, there's all sorts of reasons that we can find variations, whether they are genetic things, but also we tend to be looking at older populations, and our ability to separate muscle divisions and connective tissue and things like that decreases with age. If you look at anatomical studies on people that are younger, we see these very clear divisions and things. And what it actually looks like is, as people get older, everything kind of starts looking like it's all part of the same stuff. So there is this error in our dissection process of how much of this is what's represented in the younger population versus this is just wear and tear and very hard to differentiate as we get older. But either way, I don't think that whether or not the lat attaches to the scapula or not influences my argument, because that would be it would work regardless. Okay. The other muscles, like the obliques and stuff, in terms of lateral bend, I wouldn't argue that the best way to train the lats is lateral bending. And if we look at the way the brachiation is described for the lats, it's not so much that the lats are meant to laterally bend, but it's meant that the lats are meant to lift the whole torso. So if you think of like your torso like a bucket and your arms like the handles, rather than the handles basically being attached at the top, it's like there was a string that went underneath, so that when we were pulling, that pulling force would be translated to our pelvis, lifting our whole torso. And this is how it's described in the Bonduk study as well. The lats are meant to basically be a thing that lifts our whole body. And there's some benefits to that at the shoulder girdle, because it decreases the amount of forces that have to be right at the glenohumeral joint and on the scapula, etc., if we have something attaching the humerus directly to our hip bone in our spine. Some of those forces don't have to be translated all the way through or directly through the glenohumeral joint if we were quote unquote brachiating. So our time as monkeys, if you believe in that sort of thing or not, either way, our history of climbing, right, those would have been very valuable things. Now we just use them to do pull downs and stuff.
So I don't think that you meant, now keep in mind that I would need to look into the leverage data of this muscle, but the pectoralis minor would play a pretty significant role in scapular depression, as well as, I guess, parts of the traps, but I'm not sure how much of a role it's going to play during like a lat pull down. However, I also don't think that you clarified how the latissimus dorsi can independently move like the sternoclavicular, acromioclavicular joints independently of any glenohumeral movement.
Okay, thank you for reminding me of that one. And the pec minor attaching on the anterior portion of the rib cage, in order to depress the scapula, the muscle has to go down the back, right? In a sense, the pec minor right, is in forward. So it's going to have a degree of scapular tipping forward force as well as pulling down, which would be the opposite of the kind of depression force that we would do in a back movement. Right. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not involved in depression, but it's going to be much more involved in depression when we're depressing in front. If we're doing a dip, right? And then the shoulder girdle is tilting down and forward as we depress versus if the shoulder is coming back because the scap's got to do this as well. So yes, that is an important muscle for depression, but the plane of motion that we are quote unquote depressing in plays an important part. But also, like, we have to also consider the relative cross-sectional areas of these. And again, that muscle, where does it attach? Right? Attaches to the coracoid process here. That's going to be a smaller internal moment than the lats attaching all the way out here, right? So the lats, from just a pure size perspective, from a specificity of action perspective and motion, and then internal moment arm, all are very much advantaged towards the sternoclavicular joint. Now, the last thing that I forgot to cover, can it act on a joint specifically? Anything that crosses multiple joints can't act on one joint in isolation. The force is always transferred across all of the joints that it's crossing. Now, whether or not movement occurs depends on whether or not the force at each joint actually contributes to or exceeds the movement of whatever resistance there would be. So for instance, when the arm is up overhead and at the glenohumeral joint, the lats are more disadvantaged from a leverage standpoint. They're becoming more parallel. And again, this is described in the Bonduc study that you referenced, is that basically the force starts to run parallel to the humerus. So if we were to take a scenario where we paralyzed the teres major and the posterior delt, and then we put your arm up overhead for a pull down, and then we stimulated the lats, what we would get would basically be just a depression motion until we essentially ran out of range. And then if we could exceed the torque demands, we would then see the glenohumeral motion, because the force on this joint, the torque generated, would be significantly higher than the glenohumeral joint because it's acting on an internal moment arm that is much longer at this joint. The reason that we can do shoulder extension, adduction at the same time as depression, retraction, etc., is because we have all those other muscles also contributing to the joint torque at the glenohumeral joint, like the teres major and the rhomboid. And I believe in that live, you said like the little teres major couldn't make up for the upper lats or something to that extent. The teres major actually is extremely substantial. If you've only looked at anatomy through two-dimensional drawings, you'll look at the teres and it looks like this small muscle. But this is the case of looking at a blanket versus a pillow, right? The lat is like a blanket. It's this sheet muscle. And if we look at it from the right perspective, it looks huge. But if we look at it from another perspective, it's super thin, right? The teres major is like a pillow. It's a thick, round, sluggy looking muscle. The actual cross-sectional area of the teres in research is slightly greater than the entire cross-sectional area of all of the lats and dissection studies. Okay. Now, obviously, there's a limitation of, these are going to be old people, etc. But we can also look at bodybuilders in general. Let me just go ahead and share this one because we haven't shared any big muscular people yet, and people like this stuff. So I have the teres highlighted over here in green. So from this perspective, the teres kind of looks small. If we look at the actual dissection studies, the functional cross-sectional area of the teres is 851 relative to 786 for the entire lats. If we look at just the superior upper portion of the lats that were more biased in shoulder extension, they're only 201. Okay. So the teres is a pretty substantial muscle. That's in cadavers. But if we look at Dorian Yates, who had one of the biggest and best backs, we can see that teres is a big, bulging, thick muscle, right? So it's hard to get an idea of how big that is cross-sectional area versus these lats that from this perspective look big, but they don't have near the depth. So especially the upper lats, even on Dorian Yates, if we were to take those, the odds of them having the same cross-sectional area as the teres are very, very small. And in some of the references that you shared as well, they talk about the insertion of the teres. It's either going to be at relatively the same distance or even more superior than the lat. So it's usually going to have better leverage as a shoulder extensor, as well as being a larger muscle in terms of its force production because it's got more cross-sectional area.
So I'm not sure what live you're referring to where I said that the teres major is not involved. I think the teres major is involved. It plays a similar role as the latissimus dorsi. I also just wanted to clarify again that I don't believe that if we're talking about the glenohumeral joint moving and the other joints are also moving, is it directly influencing those joints or is it indirectly influencing those joints? Because, for example, when you said that that crosses two joints cannot directly influence independently each joint, I have to disagree because there's the hamstrings and also the quadriceps, where you have parts of the muscle which are influencing either the hip joint or the knee joint, and you can keep one joint stable while moving the other joint. A good example of this would be doing like a hip extension versus a leg curl. So I don't think that that's entirely true. You can do that with some muscles. And I also think that saying that there's all direct attachments, there's no indirect attachments, takes away kind of the nuances between them. So for example, like you can't, I mean, are you arguing also that like the latissimus dorsi can do scapular protraction? It's the opposite of like scapular retraction, or is it just retraction?
Well, no, the protraction would be an eccentric action for the latissimus dorsi because it only pulls the sternoclavicular joint into retraction and depression, right?
And do we also have EMG data demonstrating that the other three muscles that are involved in scapular depression are just not active at all in congruence with the lats? Because from my understanding, the attachment on the scapula is an origin attachment. It's very stable. It's not going to be moving like the scapula as much as it would be moving like the humerus, for example.
So it's an origin attachment. So that means that what would be the force vector on the scapula from that portion of the lat if it attached? It would be pulling the inferior portion of the scapula towards the humerus.
Wait, doesn't the origin typically pull the insertion closer?
It would just like those 2 points would be approximately, but in this case, it would really just depend on which one has more force, like holding it still. So, is the rhomboid force resisting upward rotation more than the force that's being pulled between the scapular border and the humerus? So, movement isn't about the whether or not a muscle crosses it per se. A muscle can cross multiple joints. So the example you gave, unlike the leg extension, leg curl, like how can I do a hip extension exercises and my knee doesn't bend? Right? How can I use my hamstrings there? Okay. It's not that the hamstrings don't produce force or torque at the knee while I'm doing hip extension. It's that the coordination of my nervous system uses enough knee extension force to counter the knee flexion force so that hip extension can happen in isolation. If I do an RDL, the way that I keep my leg straight is there's still a little bit of quad activation, just enough to resist the knee flexion component of the hamstrings in that position. Same thing for the other way, like anything else, right? The reason that I can do a squat without being pulled forward by my rec fem is one, I'm going to recruit less of it, but two, I'm just going to have net more hip extension forces than hip flexion forces, which are going to allow me to stand up and knee extend at the same time. So muscles can't choose to only apply the force at one joint. If they have an internal moment, if the ability to produce torque at a joint, when there's tension in that muscle, that force is present. The movement is the net forces of everything acting on that joint. Okay, so the lats can't move just the glenohumeral joint or just the sternoclavicular joint on their own because they have the ability to somehow choose to act on a joint, but the coordination of all of our muscles helps us fix a joint by counteracting the force of a muscle at one joint so that it can express motion at just the other joint.
So I guess just I have to ask this again because there are muscles that are around the sternoclavicular joint that could help to stabilize if you are keeping them still. Why is it that if the latissimus dorsi directly acts onto the sternoclavicular joint, the acromioclavicular joint, the scapulothoracic joint, that this muscle cannot just move those joints, even though there are other muscles around that could stabilize it, similar to how you were talking about the quadriceps stabilizing specific joints that the hamstrings move while the other joint moves.
It could if you created the scenario for that to happen. And all you would have to do is create a scenario where the glenohumeral joint was fixed, right?
And
So a
naturally.
scenario for this would be if I put my arms up on the counter like this so that I couldn't shoulder extend, right? I could do just the depression action of the lats without shoulder extension being able to happen, right? You just need the constraints. Now, muscles that stabilize the sternal, the clavicle, that doesn't affect whether or not the humerus would move. So it's okay saying that the SEM can stabilize the clavicle. That would essentially be more of an antagonist action, right? So yes, it helps stabilize the joint itself, but it's that I don't see how you're making the connection to that and the lat movement, that part. That
Oh, that also,
if
sorry,
can I just say one thing
yeah, go
and then
ahead.
let you go? I don't have a ton like more to do on this, Braden. So just if we are getting too far into this, because we're not, I don't think either of us is going to, there's no study saying, hey, here's how we compared everything in the exact context we need. And I can just hand you the reference saying, here's why I'm right and you're wrong. And I just don't want to spend like the whole hour talking about this. I want to get to the other studies. I'm sorry.
I,
I
I was
didn't mean
about
to cut
to,
you off. I just wanted to give you permission to cut me off.
yeah, Elle, I'm going to let you finish, but I think we are starting to go into a little bit of a circle. I'm going to catch it early. So, Elle, if you want to finish your statement.
Yeah, sure. If you are doing this and oh wait, like shoulder extension to try to take away glenohumeral movement, the only issue I see with that is that now you're also like you don't know if your pectoralis minor or another muscle that does play a really strong role in scapular depression would be primarily moving the scapula in that for scapular depression. So we don't have that evidence to say that the lats are like the strongest scapular depressor in specific like areas. We have the leverage data, but it's leverage data with the lats. And if we're trying to make, I guess, absolute statements about how the lats move different joints, we need to have absolute evidence. And I don't think we do because the lats, in my personal opinion, based off of how I've learned it, indirectly move the sternoclavicular and acromioclavicular joint because they don't they can't indirectly move or sorry independently move that joint of the other ones. With the glenohumeral joint, if you keep your like arm all the way down here and you're like not moving anything up here, it is possible to move the glenohumeral joint very little, not that much, but I don't think that that's a claim that you can make when you have other scapular depressors that are much stronger.
Okay. I think what I said stands up against her argument. I don't need to go through it again. And I think we can move on to the next section for
Yep.
time's sake. I would like to address just one last thing. And if you want to play this clip where it says Little Terry's, just so that because she asked where that reference came from.
Oh,
Yep.
I know
You
what
can
live
play
you're
that.
talking about now. Yeah, that
Okay.
was on the fly kind of live, so I'm not surprised that I
Okay.
missed.
All
Like,
right. I was just pointing that out. Okay. But you also said in your most recent video, the one where you walked back the absolutism, that you don't think that we could hypertrophy the lower lats because the QL and the external obliques surround them, which I'm assuming that's just a misspeak because those muscles are actually deep to the lats. They're not around them. But I don't know what that would have to do with our ability to actually grow that region. I'm not, oops, I lost my ability to share.
Oh, yeah, I was going to share something here. I'll give you,
Sorry.
there you go.
Okay. So there we go. Cool. Save my settings. So if we're looking at those muscles are deep, the external oblique is relatively more lateral to the lats. If we're just basing it off this anatomy image, obviously there's going to be individual variability, but I don't understand what the external obliques being there has anything to do with why I couldn't hypertrophy the lower region of the lats. And I don't have a scientific study for this, so I'm just going to go 100% bro mode and show that I have had people hypertrophy that region of the lats. So this is Alberto Nunez. Okay. Here's another guy I've worked with, Hawk here. The top left photo is before, and then the other ones are just three poses after. I don't know if these type of results reach clinical significance or not. For me, they do, but for sure visibly we can see it is possible to hypertrophy that region of the lats. And yes, sure, these are exceptional results. Like, not, it's not like everybody's like, hey, yeah, you go do one of Kassem's pull down and you're going to get it back like Alberto Nunez in 6 weeks or anything. That's not what I'm claiming. I'm just saying we have actual evidence showing hypertrophy changes in these guys who are natural athletes using these methods. And I don't understand the logic of why the QL or the external oblique would somehow prohibit growth in the lower portion of the lats.
So I was not, I think I clarified this at the very end, but I was saying that you cannot hypertrophy the lower lats differently to the upper lats in the sense that you're only growing the lower lats. So I do think you can hypertrophy the lower lats. It's just going to grow very similarly, if not non-significantly different, to the upper lats with those lat exercises. And then and I think that you could probably see that when you look at the before and after with your clients, where the upper region, obviously the very upper region is already going to be thin because that's where the insertion attachment is. But if you look at both of those pictures, it does look like the entire lat grew, not just the lower lat portion alone. And then as far as the quadratus lumborum and the external obliques, one's lateral, one's deep. I would say that that's round if I'm trying to speak to the layman's person. And as far as using that, I mainly use that because of a Japanese study that Juan sent me. And he was talking about how the lower lats were experiencing differential activation while doing like lateral bending. And I'm just saying that those muscles are they're stronger lateral bending muscles. So since you're doing surface EMG is just from the surface, it's going to pick up signals from other muscles around the area. So it's more likely that you're going to see like background noise from those muscles just because they are going to be working more.
There's a difference between lateral bending through just the torso and lateral bending from the arm, where basically the force is between the hip and the humerus, and it's not just on the rib cage. So I agree that in terms of just straight trunk bending and motion, the lats are not going to be they're not going to be the dominant muscle. But in terms of translating force from the humerus to the pelvis, that's where we will probably see that. And I actually is the one those studies that Juan had are ones that I sent him, and I translated them for him. I translated them for me. He got the benefit of me already doing it. But if you look at the context of those, like one study was, yeah, they were just pushing through the arm lateral bending. But then the other study, these people are doing, and for the life of me, I can't think of the exercise. It's like a standing push, like basically it's like a dip motion where you're pushing on parallel bars, like that type of thing. And then they're like pushing from their pelvis towards it or whatnot. So it's okay, there's a lot of force. It's basically like a dip where you're trying to push your pelvis towards your shoulder, right? So the force is going all the way from your hip to a bar. That's not the same as, say, if I were to do trunk rotation or pushing my shoulder sideways into something or whatnot. We just have to look at the context of lateral bending in these studies is somewhat different. And also in those Japanese studies, they wouldn't, what we would usually refer to as depression, there seems to be a language thing where they'll call it like a pelvic movement when really it's just approximating the humerus to the pelvis. And they're just looking at, okay, in this instance, the arm was fixed because it was like in a dip thing. So the pelvis went up rather than, say, in a pull down where the shoulder girdle would be the thing that was moving and the hip would be the stationary thing. Right. So there's a little bit of a language thing there. I did share those studies and the translations in the Dropbox if you want to dig through them any deeper.
Yeah, I did read through them, and I guess my point still stands that there's going to be background from the other muscles. And that's another thing that I wanted to point out because I noticed that you were looking at the studies that I was talking about with the similarities. I found a couple reviews where they were talking about background noise from other muscles with surface EMG as potential errors, where there's up to 30% differences just because of a background noise. And you can clean up data all you want, but surface EMG is still not going to be 100% pinpoint accurate. And based off of the other muscles that I've seen with hypertrophy data, like the rectus femoris, there are much drastic differences between the EMG of, let's say, a leg press and like a leg extension. There's significant differences between that. Much more, I hate saying significance because it implies statistical, but I'm just talking about like very big changes between the, let's say, leg extension and leg press. And then you also see that in the hypertrophy of the rectus femoris and the vastus muscles. You don't see the same crazy differences with the lats, which is the main reason why I'm saying that you probably can't like bias the lats to that significant of an extent that you're like independently growing the lower lats like crazy compared to the upper lats. And that was my main point because I get a lot of people asking me if they can like only grow their lower lats with one exercise, and I just don't think that the evidence suggests that.
Okay. So this is a good transition, I think, into just we can start talking about the EMG studies. And I think my so we're probably not going to land on too dissimilar of a conclusion of like how to train after this, right? Even though we're disagreeing on the anatomy and stuff and whatever, but we'll just have different reasons to come up with the same conclusions probably. But I would say one of the biggest critiques I have with the limited amount of your content that I've consumed, which is why I made the few responses that I did, is the I guess you could call them some of these things miscommunications if you want, but the use of certain studies, the context, the reference, sometimes, in my opinion, they're just not represent the statements are not representing what the study says, or that maybe sometimes it's a mistake like the PEC thing where, it's literally the wrong graph or something. But let's take in context the studies that you're using for positive differentiation, and they contain range of motion, most of them at two joints, right? And significant, like their exercises, their significant force. And now we're comparing that to these other studies that are not that same context. And we're saying, look at the size look at the effect size or the clinical significance or the statistical significance in these studies, and then look at these other ones, and they're not even the same like contextual type of study. We can't compare an isometric on a single position to something that moves two joints through a full range of motion with a high intensity contraction. So let's start with just the external rotation study. So this is the first one that you referenced. If I have sharing ability, I'll go ahead and just share this screenshot if you can.
Oh wait, I gave it to L. Hang on. There you go.
Oh, Zoom. Okay, so in your first video, this is the first chart you show, and you say basically no statistical significant difference in this. And you're comparing this to the results from those other studies. Now, let's look at this into context, okay? This was a study done on external rotation, which I think we could probably both agree that external rotation is not really a function of the lats. And these are the exercises or the closest representation I could come up with, because they didn't include the pictures in the study, but these are essentially the exercises that are in the study. They used a 1 kilogram dumbbell to do these exercises. And I'm curious why you think that an EMG, which we know is already a limited proxy study, on very low intensity versions of an exercise that isn't even a direct action or function of the lats would be something that we would use as evidence for the lats not being differentiated. I see this as a bad use of a citation. Just because they happen to measure lats doesn't mean that this study is contextually relevant to the topic of can you bias the lats. Like I wouldn't expect any differentiation in the lats in some light intensity exercises where the lats essentially going to be doing almost nothing in all of them other than a little bit of joint stabilization. So I'll go ahead and stop and let you respond.
Yeah, no, I do agree that that's one of the like very limited studies. I don't think that's the strongest study to support the claim. So I literally just found a bunch of EMG studies that were with the lats because I was trying to find as many as I could. There's not a lot of regional EMG studies on the lats, and that happened to be one of them. So you just happened to pick like one of the worst ones that I had there, aside from maybe like the internal rotation one, which is also not like the best one to choose. But I did cite like I want to say, was it 4 or 5 across all the different videos that I made? It was like 4 or 5 or something. I think I posted the fifth one to my story. But that being said, like it's not just I didn't just use like one study. I try to use as many studies that I can if I can find them, even if they're really bad. That being said, there's other times where I do use studies in a more calculated way. So, for example, that one with the eccentric versus concentric and the interpretation of the Widrick et al. 2010 study with the Nuzzo analysis of like concentric versus eccentric strength combined with two other EMG studies. That was a little bit more of a calculated approach. But when it comes to like limited data, which is also why I made that follow-up video on like how it's not absolute, that was like one of the reasons why I did that.
Okay. I would like to go through these individually just so you don't have to summarize the whole argument every single time. It's interesting that you said you try to use as many studies as possible, even if some of them are super bad. And I think that's where you and I very much disagree ideologically on this. Whereas I think is that, hey, a study should have to be, it should have to meet a certain threshold for me to consider it as relevant to the topic, right? If anything, I think we're clouding the evidence, and especially in the context of social media where it's flash a graph, flash a title, flash a study. Like people don't realize how insignificant this study is unless they go and read it. All they saw was a graph where you're like, look, here's evidence that the lats are not significant. And I don't think it's evidence at all. Like I don't think this fits any portion of qualification that like this should be used for that. And I don't think if we asked the authors if their results here could be extrapolated to this conversation, that they would all agree here. I think they would all be like, no, this has nothing to do with the question of whether or not we can bias the lats in actual lat exercises. Okay, go ahead.
So I just wanted to clarify again that this was because there was an overall limitation to the amount of data that we have. When we don't have a limitation to the amount of data that we have, or when I find better data, I use that instead. That being said, I use multiple different studies there. So giving an overview of limited data, I don't think is just using bad data all the time. You can use really good data and highlight that, which I think I do because I don't highlight that study as much as I do the other studies that I cited. So I think that it's giving an overview of very limited data is not just citing bad studies to cite bad studies.
What is wrong with excluding studies that don't actually fit the question and just saying we just have that this is all we have, right? Because some things we have zero studies on. Like that's just the truth. And maybe there's a thing where we have one, right? But why I don't understand why there is a motivation to just try and say, hey, I'm just going to include to get a certain number of studies because I think that clouds the argument. I should be like, look, if we have one, if we have two, that's what we got. This is what we say. You should take into context that there's only a few, because especially if we're making some opinions or statements, and then I cite five, that makes it seem like it's more powerful of an argument than it really is, even though some of those studies really aren't contributing to that argument at all. Like, I don't think that this contributes to the argument in either direction. I think it's completely irrelevant. And so moving from 2 to 4 studies to me in this case just misleads on how much actual evidence we have on the topic. I think you should say, yeah, I think you should cut it to just we only have this and not try and inflate the number of studies by including lower and lower relevant studies.
I'm going to let Elle respond, and then I'm going to have you guys move forward.
Okay.
So I have to say that I'm just going to agree to disagree on this because I was giving an overview of the limited data, but also depending on how they do external rotation, there is going to be like a little bit of force on the lats, even if it's isometric or it's just stabilization. So it's like again, it depends on how you interpret it. To me, I was just giving an overview of limited data, and that's just my opinion on the topic. So I don't do it with all of the data that I ever cite. So.
Okay. Cool. All right. So I'll move on then. We won't spend much time then talking about the internal rotation study, but I just wanted to show for perspective the exercises in here. And that way people can decide whether or not they think that this information is relevant to the lats. But I think we're going to end in the same spot. So let's talk about the first study that actually investigates the lat action, which would be the study by Park. So this study, basically they did isometrics in a few different positions. So you can see here how close the sensors were, and they did a pull down, an adduction, an internal rotation, and a shoulder depression exercise. I think it's important to note that their pull down exercise is pulling down against a fixed bar. Same thing with their adduction, whereas the other two, they were just pushing in somebody's hands, which maybe We can extrapolate why they saw some of the data there. But my critiques in terms of the way that you presented this study is that you presented a quote where basically they found no significance in one of the measurements. Just shortly below that, they also explain where they did find significant differences between muscle and exercise interactions. And so to me, I feel like if I'm going to review what a study says, I shouldn't just give the evidence that kind of suits my argument. So I'm not going to read through all of that, but you just looking at this, we can talk about this is probably a good place if you want to talk about the relevance of statistical significance versus effect size and clinical significance as we're looking at this stuff. But there's different ways to look at this in terms of the interaction. If we look at the ratios of these two things, so here we have the exercise condition where they were doing the isolated, like basically repetitions with 50% of their maximal voluntary contraction load. And they did significantly more medial lat than lateral lat in the shoulder extension, and more of the lateral lat than the medial lat in depression. As intensity got added, we saw that essentially these things got similar, and we actually saw a couple of these things flip, but there's still that ratio of more depression in the lateral or lower lat. And I think a good explanation for this is the fact that their extension exercise also included depression because they were pulling down on a bar, and you can't pull down on a bar maximally without also depressing, because all the force that you apply into the bar has to also be then applied to the shoulder. You can't push down on the bar without there also being a depression force at the shoulder. And then I just wanted to point out their actual conclusion. And I think if we're presenting studies and we come up with a different conclusion than what the authors did, we should have a really good explanation for that. And so I just wanted to point out in the Park study, their study or their conclusion is basically our data suggests that the medial and lateral branches of the latissimus dorsi are activated differently with changes in isometric exercise. Okay, I won't read the whole rest of it there unless you feel you want to, and I can leave it up. But I just wanted to point it out there that it seemed like you only presented part of the results and ignored what the actual author's takeaway or conclusion from the study was.
So I'm gonna explain the whole reason why I did that again. But the EMG data, when we're talking about like different muscles that can and have been shown to be able to be differentially grown, they show much more drastic differences. I could have shown that it was statistically significant. I could have shown that it was not significant. Whatever quote that I showed, I think you can see from the data up there that it's not that drastic of a difference when you compare it to other EMG data, for example, from the quadriceps and the vasti muscles. And then again, like when we're talking about can you like depress the scapula and are there other scapular depressors involved? There's other muscles around that area that are going to be playing a significant role in scapular depression. So I guess it's the same argument as I had before, where there's other muscles involved that play very significant roles in scapular depression, have a much stronger attachment to the lower scapula. And also, EMG is just very variable, especially surface EMG, where other muscles are around it. And as you said, the lats are a very thin muscle. So the likelihood of them being contaminated with EMG from other muscles is very high.
Okay, so when your criticisms of the EMG apply to any conclusion that you make from the study, for
I
or
would have
against.
So if I would have to see very drastic differences for me to be convinced, because there's other muscles that, like for example, let's see, you could talk about the deltoids. We don't really have direct hypertrophy data, so it's not entirely conclusive. But the deltoids, there's other muscles around the deltoids. For example, I guess you could say if you put what is it called, in the correct place, you're gonna get, I don't know, freaking supraspinatus or something like that. But there's other muscles around that area, but you see very black and white differences with the delts. You don't see the black and white differences with the latissimus dorsi.
Yeah, but you're comparing studies that use range of motion and we'll say more prototypical exercises, where here we're doing essentially isometrics in a very limited context, and there are overlapping force conditions in some of these isometrics, which would mean we should see less of a difference. Anyway, so I'm not going to push back at all on the limitations of EMG, but you have to apply that to everything, and you have to take in the context of, in this study, they're studying much more similar conditions than the exercises where you're saying, yeah, here I see significant difference in the quads one. I'm like, yeah, the difference between a squatting pattern and knee extension, isolated knee extension, is very different than doing a couple isometrics here, right? You have whether or not we're going through range of motion, we have multiple joint actions versus pretty much a singular, or at least an attempt to isolate a singular joint action in some of these motions. I don't think that the evidence here, I'm not saying it is strong evidence, but I am saying that I think an honest interpretation of this, if you were actually going to take it, is it lean towards favoring differentiation. All limitations there. I don't think any of this evidence is, when we're talking about the EMG stuff, is going to be strong because it is very limited context and it is a limited proxy. But I think an honest look at this evidence leans in the direction of, okay, I'm looking at this. I can see the differences. I can see what the authors concluded. I can see the context of the exercises and where that could have affected the data. And I conclude that, like, all right, if I had to hedge my bets, I would say this is slightly in favor of, yeah, you can functionally differentiate the lats, right? Not the other way around. And I definitely wouldn't present a single part of that evidence if I was using this study for my argument.
So I could go into the whole entire reasons why I think that there should be more drastic differences between different parts of a muscle in EMG to show that you can differentially grow that muscle to a significant extent. And I think that the large amount of evidence, or not the large, but the evidence that we do have is suggesting that there is not that drastic of a difference between the upper and lower lat in terms of activation. I'm going to be honest, I feel like this entire conversation is pointless in the sense that we're both going to be recommending at least doing some sort of adduction and some sort of shoulder extension like movement, like a row or something like that, mainly because there's other muscles involved. As I said, your traps, your, if you want to talk about rhomboids, your pectoralis minor, there's other muscles that are involved in the muscle actions that you're talking about. I don't think that the latissimus dorsi is considered a very strong scapular depressor, at least without any movement from the glenohumeral joint. I don't think that it can move the sternoclavicular joints or the acromioclavicular joints without also moving without moving the glenohumeral joints. I just don't think that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that you're going to see significant crazy growth with the lower lats and not with the upper lats or vice versa. Maybe you're going to see more growth of the muscles around the area, but I don't think that you're going to see significant differences in growth because there's just not there, as you said, or as I guess put it with the multiple joint actions, it's not like one part of the lat is experiencing antagonist inhibition while the other part is not. So it's just, I don't see how that's the conclusion you're coming to.
Yeah, I said we probably wouldn't have too large of a takeaway. And I've seen some of your suggestions on this too. And like I said, it's like, all right, we're going to have different views on the lats. Neither one of us have evidence outside of our own experience and observation in terms of the magnitude of if any of this could or couldn't work. So I think the premise of this, we're using this lat discussion, but the premise of our, we'll say, core disagreement is how I'm looking at how you're using these references and citations. And so I think if we look at it that way and we don't harp on like how much of a big difference we think, we both have our opinions there, but I don't have a study on hypertrophy. You don't have a study on hypertrophy. These EMG studies we have are limited. And if your position would have been like, hey, I don't think we have any strong evidence that you can bias the lats in the scientific literature, I would have no qualms with that. It is what evidence you provided to make that case, what you said about that evidence, and the fact that in multiple cases you also labeled that evidence as strong. So I think that the interpretation of these studies was incorrect, dishonest, or misleading, or a combination of in some of these cases. And that's my ultimate qualm rather than, I don't really care if we have two different opinions on lats, especially like if we have different opinions on things that we don't have concrete evidence on. Cool. That's what different coaches and different people and sharing different opinions is all about. I do, however, think that the way you present your evidence as being very scientific based, using the studies, using the charts, and not representing those properly, like that's what I find misleading because it makes it seem like there is a consensus or a stronger argument to one condition than the other. And also, I just don't like things being presented in a way that I don't think represents what they actually say.
I guess your qualms with with my post on the lats, is very similar to my problems with your post on the eccentric concentric debate, because it's the same exact qualm. I guess we all have our own opinions on what we find misleading. That being said, like I think that's like the reason why we both have contention with each other's content.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's perfectly fine to have different interpretations on things. I do, though, think there is a threshold where there are certain things that are somewhat evident, especially when we're going away from what the authors themselves have concluded about the evidence in there. So there's only one more study here for me to go over. If you want me to do that, or if you want me to skip it, Braydon.
Let's make this the final study. I'll give both of you your closing statement, and then I think we can, if you guys are down for it, we can do another debate on your eccentric concentric arguments.
Okay.
Out of curiosity, or sorry, not out of curiosity, but if I might just also add that I think that authors can also make a lot of biased and wrong conclusions multiple times. So it's important to also look at the data, which is why I look at the data the way that I do. Even if this, like the study conclusion came to something different, if the data doesn't show it as drastically, then I'm not going to view that study in the same way. That's why we all interpret studies differently. So I think that saying that calling me misleading and like dishonest about a study is kind of hyperbole when you look at the fact that people interpret studies differently, and that's just how science works.
Okay. I wasn't saying you as a person are dishonest. I'm saying specific things that you said seem misleading or dishonest. For example, I think the practice of a study that found mixed results in different conditions, only presenting the condition that favors your argument, yeah, I find that misleading. Okay. Now, that's a characterization of something you did or said, not a characterization of who you are as a person, just so that I should be able to criticize you or have a difference of opinion on your interpretation of that without it being taken as a
Oh
personal
yeah.
attack, if that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm not taking it as a personal attack, but what I'm saying is that it's everybody's opinion on what we find other people's opinion on. I don't think that we can definitively say it's, hey, this is a misleading opinion or this is a dishonest opinion when everybody interprets studies differently. So it's, yeah, as I said, I find that to be a little bit of hyperbole because everybody's going to interpret something differently. And if you look at like how I have interpreted like other EMG studies as it concerns like with the rectus femoris and vastus lateralis or whatnot, it's just that's the way that I was interpreting it. So it's yeah, that's
Could you both agree that there are people who can interpret studies wrong, objectively wrong?
yeah,
Yes.
I think that you can like objectively interpret studies wrong, but I think that objectively interpreting studies wrong takes a lot more than what some people think. If you're looking at the data and you're presenting the data, then I don't think that, and you're presenting the data and you're not like literally saying this is a number, but the data says another number, then I don't think that's wrong. If one study comes to statistical significance, but you don't think it's clinically significant, which is basically what my claim was, I don't think that's valid conclusion to say that it's objectively wrong.
Okay.
And I think this is where somewhat of a group consensus around things can shift what's the more accepted interpretation than another in these areas where the results just aren't as clear. And that's where these type of conversations really help because it's like, all right, how could go either way? How do I know? People need to talk and hash out their different perspectives on these. Okay, so the last one was the Brown study. There we go. So this is another isometric study, and this was the one like I can't tell if you when you say strong evidence if you're referring to only this one or the pool as a whole, it seemed different depending on your second video versus your most recent video, kind of seemed to lump them all together as strong evidence. And this is the chart you showed. And my issue with showing this or is that, one, this wasn't a comparison that they were trying to make in the study, and the graphic that they made was not meant to handle the, we'll say, the level of detail if you actually wanted to make that. And a prime example of that, so what they're showing here is they're trying to use these colors to simulate the relative activation in these muscles. And because they use a 30% scale, you can have essentially a condition where there's only a 1% difference between regions and they look the same, and another where they'd essentially be 30% different. Oh, I'm sorry, they'd be 1% different and look different, or 30% different and look the same. And they actually had that in the study. So the L6 in the adduction was only 1% difference than the L3 in extension. Okay. But they look different. Whereas the L6 between the two exercise conditions was 28% different, and they look the same. Okay. And this should just be good evidence that these charts were not meant to be compared against each other for that type of analysis, which is probably why they didn't do it in the study, and they didn't run statistics on the comparison of these two things. So for the question we're asking, they weren't intending for this to be used. If I try and make it as close to a representation of that using the actual data from the study, it looks much more visibly different, right? So this is now on a 10% scale, right? You can see the numbers up here where it's like they're not the exact same. Okay, we got a 70% L6 here, 43% in this condition, relative similar L3s of 73, 79. So the overall ratio of upper, lower, and distribution was actually different if we were to try and look at the data this way. And again, this is my own kind of like construction of the data just to show that difference. But also in the adduction or adduction condition, they didn't find significant difference between them. They essentially described all of the lats as being a prime mover for that position or that exercise. But in the extension, they did find statistical differences between the segments. So because there was statistical difference in one condition and not the other, we can infer that those conditions were not the same, because in one, they were all deemed similar, and the other, they were deemed statistically significant. And that's not something that we would see in this graph here, which isn't necessarily meant to show a comparison between these. It's just to show the relative distribution of those things. And some other things that were mentioned on here, and so then this is again just the data, right, is their conclusion: the results of this investigation have suggested that the timing and intensity of each muscle segment's activation were coordinated across muscle and influenced by the muscle segment's moment arm and its mechanical line of action and intended movement of the shoulder. Basically, if you read the study, similar to the Park study, at no point in here is the language such that the authors are saying, hey, this is evidence that the lats cannot be differentiated. In fact, it's the other way around, even though this one isn't directly investigating that question. And the context of this is, again, it's an isokinetic. These guys they're in a cage, like with a cast that's attached to the cage, and they're applying an adduction, extension, flexion, or abduction force within that constraint. The expectation of the differences there are not what we'd expect in something where we can actually go through range of motion, where we can move at multiple joints. So we wouldn't expect to see differences here that we would if we were to see a study comparing rows and pull down variations against each other. Okay. And then I'll bring up a comment from Paul, which was referencing the internal moment arms here. And I know a lot of people, they use the Ackland study, which I think has a ton of issues in terms of there definitely was a mistake made, I think, in those, because it doesn't match any of the other evidence. So either everybody else that's ever done internal moment arms on the lats is wrong, or something happened in the Ackland study. But they did measure internal moment arms in this. And if we actually look at them, they are essentially very similar. Unlike the Ackland study that had in this relative position very different. So they had a different relationship between the divisions and just also different total magnitude, etc. Where in this instance, they found very similar internal moment arms for both conditions. Why, if neuromechanical matching was a thing, if leverage and internal moment arms was a factor, would we expect a difference to show up in these conditions if essentially they have the same leverage between the two conditions and they're in a position where it's from the same position and there's not a huge functional differentiation between adduction and extension within that position, because we use these terms to describe movement, but really it's lats pull insertion to origin, and there's not a big difference between insertion to origin in the context of this study. So to just summarize that, I don't think that's strong evidence. I don't think the comparison they made was meant for this conversation. And I think we're like being a bit misleading if we're like, hey, all based off of these other principles, we would expect to see a difference. In this study, principally, we'd probably expect them to be the same if we thought like neuromechanical matching was actually a thing, because the leverages are very similar.
So I'm just gonna repeat what I said at the other study as well. Statistical significance does not indicate clinical significance. And when you're talking about not active versus active with the other muscles, there's one part that's active, the other part is inactive. So I don't think that you can come to that same conclusion based off of when you're looking at the comparison. So yes, there's up to 27% differences, maybe a little bit more, but as I said, there's a lot of muscles underneath the latissimus dorsi. For me to be convinced that there's going to be a drastic difference, there needs to be drastic differences in the EMG, and we just don't see that. So it's just like repeating what I said before, so I don't want to like waste any time right now. But as far as the Ackland study goes, there was only 8 cadavers, so I don't really take the Ackland study to be like for gospel. I never have, so I don't really know why it was brought up. But yeah, that's about all my thing is there.
Okay. I would like to give both of you a closing statement to wrap this up, and we can go from there. Elle, would you like to go first?
Uh, you can go first. I feel like that you have a pretty good talking point.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know why it keeps getting pushed to the significance on these things where basically, let me just put it this way. I think we have a disagreement on lat bias, which is not that big of a deal. And neither of us has really strong evidence. If I were to summarize why I believe the way I believe, none of the evidence that you presented is stuff that I would actually consider as part of my argument. And I think that's my biggest issue with kind of your position is I think you've used a bunch of evidence that I wouldn't consider relevant for many of the limitations that you have pointed out. And if we look at more direct evidence, there are multiple studies, the Japanese ones that I shared with you or whatnot. So I think, about 6 where none of them I would consider strong evidence. They all have limitations. They're EMG studies, etc. But I interpret them as all leaning in the favor of being able to bias the lats. And I think there are much better studies that you could have chosen in this argument if I think you were taking an honest look at all of the research. But the majority of the way I feel is more core biomechanics, being able to see that we can actually change length in different portions of the lats with different motion, that's one of the things that we're able to measure now with shear modulus, which is one of my it's one of my favorite technologies, versus looking at just activation, but actually looking at the shear forces within the muscle. I'm fine. Like, I don't have any beef with your position for lats. My main criticism, like as I stated, is I just don't think that the way that you have used this stuff in your content is very representative of the difference between the research you think is good versus what you hear. Like, I think if this was the research that you knew about and you didn't know about any of the other stuff, I think the appropriate place is, yeah, we really don't have any research on this topic. What we do have is very irrelevant. And you did pull back on the absolutism, which kudos for that. But I still wouldn't call any of this evidence strong. And I think the main place that we disagree is just our overall approach to interpretation and science communication. And that's probably a whole other conversation if we wanted to dig down it. But I don't have a beef with you. I don't have a beef about lats. My main criticism, if it means anything to you, is I would just like you to be a little bit more picky about what studies you pick. And I would like you to maybe be a little bit more honest. Sounds bad, but I would just like you to be a little bit more thorough in the evidence that you present rather than trying to present more, maybe present a little bit more context of less.
Okay. Thank you, Cass. All right, Elle, you have the floor.
All right, so I used a combined understanding of the different like the tendon morphology of different parts of the lats, as the one on the insertion is more mobile than the ones that are on like the scapula or on the thoracolumbar fascia. And combining that with the very drastic differences with other muscles that have been found to be segmentally grown, biased, whatever you want to call it, I think that the evidence that we currently have where there aren't drastic differences is fair enough to combine the two and say that it's pretty strong. That being said, it is your opinion to say whether or not evidence is strong or not. I think that calling evidence that is already limited dishonest just because somebody interpreted a different way than you, I don't think that's entirely like, I think that's assuming that everybody's going to think the same way that you do when it comes to reading a study. And so, combined with the fact that the lats are going to be doing mostly the same thing, there's not two different muscle actions where one is going to have antagonist inhibition, while the other one is not going to be suffering from antagonist inhibition, something like that. Is not, or if it's on completely different planes of movement, like with like with the delts and like the rear delts or the front delts. All that combined with the drastic EMG differences we see with those muscles, I don't think that it is completely weak evidence. That being said, I feel like this entire conversation was pointless in the sense that we're both recommending to do an adduction, some sort of shoulder extension variation. And with that, and the reason why I recommend that is just because there's other muscles around there that are going to pick up the slack for those, I guess, secondary movements, for example, scapular depression. So I don't think that it's not important to do both. That being said, I don't think that I take the same like approach when it comes to like data that's limited versus data that's not limited, depending on what kind of not depending on the kind of argument that we're talking about. So for example, the first argument that you ever had a contention with me on, I think I hope we could agree that lifting a weight up is harder than putting a weight down if the weight is the same. That being said, like I feel like we're gonna have the same end all conclusion on what to do. So that's the only reason why I said it's pointless. But other than that, thank you for coming on and thank you for taking your time out of your day. I really do appreciate it.
Cass, I
Y'all
muted you. Sorry,
are
man. You're still muted, buddy. You're still muted.
oh boy.
Cass.
Oh, sorry. I thought since you muted me, you unmuted me.
No, sorry.
So hopefully it wasn't completely pointless. But the only thing I want to clarify is my position would be more so that I think we need to do a vertical and a horizontal pull, not that we need to include a frontal and a sagittal plane. We're I think there's a lot of similarity between frontal and sagittal plane type pulls. And for me, hitting all of those muscles, it's more important that we pull vertical and horizontal than that we pull down on two different planes. So we don't exactly have the same conclusion, other than that we both believe that we should use multiple exercises there because there are multiple muscles involved.
So
Yeah.
frontal and sagittal plane are the two major muscle actions I'm referring to. So for example, going from like flexion, up flex position to maybe not like pure shoulder extension, depending on how you define it. But I was just saying like the major muscle action. So if you want to switch the words and say frontal and sagittal, that's like up to you.
I said vertical and horizontal, a row and a pull down. Both in sagittal would be fine, right? In my context. Like I'm saying that something pulling from above, something pulling from in front of you, not
Oh,
pulling down from here and here. I think it's more important that we do something where it's a pull with retraction and then something with a pull with depression than it is that we pull down in two different planes. Okay. That's where our base recommendation of like minimally viable is slightly different.
okay. Interesting. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I think I'll disagree with L. I think this conversation will be productive in that we can prove that we can have constructive discourse and still disagree. So I
Oh,
actually
no,
think,
I agree. Sorry, I agree.
no, you're good. No, you're good. I can see where you're coming from, but I am actually really excited for this conversation because I don't think there's enough of these in the zeitgeist. And so I think this is really good. So L, Cass, I want to thank you both for coming on. If you guys want to come on for another debate, we can line it up. So with that, we'll close it and we'll see you guys around.